October 2001, Cambridge, Massachusetts. The doors of Polaroid Corporation closed on a Tuesday morning. 6,000 American workers, chemists, engineers, coding technicians, assembly line supervisors received termination notices before noon. The Waltham manufacturing facility, which had produced instant film for the entire world, went dark without ceremony. Machines that had run continuously for 19 years were shut down mid-cycle. Partially coated rolls of film sat in the chambers where they stopped. The company that had invented an entirely new category of photography that had made the darkroom the processing lab and the 2-week wait obsolete in a single afternoon in 1948 could not pay its creditors. It filed for Chapter 11 protection with $948 million in debt and no clear path to solvency. 23 years earlier, Polaroid had recorded $1.4 billion in annual revenue. The one-step camera, a white plastic body with a rainbow stripe priced at $25, had been the best-selling camera in the world for 3 consecutive years. There was no Japanese competitor threatening Polaroid's position, no German optical manufacturer undercutting its prices, no foreign alternative to its chemistry. Polaroid had won the instant photography market so completely that Kodak had entered the category in 1976, and Polaroid had sued them out of it, collecting $909 million in damages after a 14-year legal battle that became one of the largest patent settlements in American history. Polaroid won the lawsuit. It did not save the company. The real story of Polaroid is not the story of a corporation that lost a market. It is the story of a company that built something Americans had never had before. The photograph delivered in your hand, still warm before the moment it captured, had finished happening and could not survive when that promise became something a $300 camera from Best Buy could replicate without film, without chemistry, and without waiting at all. Somewhere in a shoebox under a bed, in an attic storage bin, in a closet that hasn't been opened since 2003, there are Polaroid prints. White bordered squares with that specific color temperature, that specific grain, that specific warmth that no digital filter has ever exactly reproduced. The photographs are still there. The company that made them possible is gone. We tell these stories every week, the American companies that built the tools that recorded American life and what the market did to them. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. This one begins in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1943. Edwin Herbert Land did not set out to build a camera company. He left Harvard University in 1932 without a degree, not because he failed, but because he was already doing work that Harvard's physics curriculum could not contain. He had become obsessed with polarized light, the phenomenon by which certain crystalline structures could filter light waves to eliminate glare, reduce reflection, and in the right configuration, make objects visible through glass, water, and atmospheric haze that would otherwise blind a human eye. He worked in a rented New York City laboratory at night, returning to Cambridge during the day to use Harvard's equipment without authorization. He was 22 years old. He was solving a problem that the American optical industry had studied for decades without resolution. By 1937, Land had a solution and a company. Polaroid Corporation was incorporated in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with a founding product that had nothing to do with cameras polarizing filters for sunglasses, automobile headlights, and scientific instruments. The camera would come later. The chemistry that would define the company's entire commercial history would arrive, as it often does in American industrial history, by accident during a family vacation in the form of a question from a 3-year-old child. The year was 1943. Land was vacationing in Santa Fe, New Mexico with his wife Helen and their daughter Jennifer. He took a photograph of Jennifer with a standard roll film camera. She asked with the directness that only a 3-year-old commands why she couldn't see the picture right now. Land had no answer that satisfied her. He spent the rest of that afternoon walking alone, working through the chemistry in his head. By the time the walk was over, he had the outline of a process, a self-developing film system that would produce a finished photographic print inside the camera itself, without a darkroom, without chemical trays, without a processing lab, and without waiting. He would spend the next 4 years turning that outline into a manufacturable product. Before Polaroid's instant system existed, the American photographer operated inside a chain of dependencies that most users accepted as simply the nature of photography. You loaded a roll of film, 12, 24, or 36 exposures into your camera. You shot the roll over days or weeks. You drove to a camera store or drugstore, left the roll at the counter, and returned, typically 1 to 2 weeks later, to collect an envelope of prints. If the exposure was wrong, if someone had blinked, if the flash had failed, you learned this 2 weeks after the moment was gone. There was no correction. There was no second chance. The photograph existed, or it did not, and you would not know which until the processing lab told you. For the American family photographer of 1947, this was not a complaint. It was simply the condition of photography. No one had ever offered an alternative. Land offered one on February 21, 1948, at the winter meeting of the Optical Society of America in New York City. He demonstrated the Model 95, a folding camera the size of a large hardcover book, weighing 4.5 pounds, finished in black leatherette, and pulled from it 60 seconds after exposure, a finished sepia-toned photographic print. The audience of optical scientists who understood exactly what they were watching responded with sustained applause. It was not a prototype. It was a production-ready camera. Land had brought stock to sell. The Model 95 entered American retail at Jordan Marsh department store in Boston on November 26, 1948, the day after Thanksgiving. Polaroid had prepared what it believed was adequate inventory for a cautious initial release. The entire stock sold out before the store closed that afternoon. By Christmas, Jordan Marsh had a waiting list of several hundred customers with no delivery date to offer them. Popular Photography magazine, the most influential camera publication in America, called the Model 95 the most significant camera invention since the Leica. The price was $89.95, equivalent to roughly $1.100 in today's money, and Americans paid it without hesitation. The United States Army moved quickly. By 1952, the Army Signal Corps had standardized Polaroid's instant ID system for personnel photography at American military installations worldwide. The ability to produce a verified photographic ID in under 2 minutes at a forward operating base at a security checkpoint in a field hospital was a capability that no conventional film system could match. The federal contract that followed was the first of dozens that would thread Polaroid's technology through the institutional infrastructure of the American government for the next 4 decades. At its peak, Polaroid employed 21,000 people across its Cambridge headquarters, its Waltham manufacturing complex and facilities in Scotland and the Netherlands. The Waltham plant alone ran 3 shifts 7 days a week, coating instant film on machinery that Land's engineers had designed and built from scratch, because no existing equipment could apply photographic emulsion, developing chemistry and timing reagents to the same substrate at the tolerance instant photography required. There was no supplier to call. Polaroid built everything it needed, because nothing it needed had ever existed before. When that plant went dark in October 2001, it took with it not just a product line. It took a manufacturing knowledge base specific to instant film chemistry, specific to Polaroid's coating tolerances, specific to the reagent pod timing that determined whether a print developed in 60 seconds or 60 minutes that had taken 40 years to accumulate and would never be rebuilt on American soil. But in 1948, none of that was visible. What was visible was a camera, a print, and 60 seconds. That was enough to change everything. In the fall of 1972, Edwin Land walked onto a stage in New York City and folded open a camera that looked like nothing the American photography industry had ever produced. The SX-70 was smaller than a paperback novel when closed. It was sheathed in genuine tan leather and brushed chrome steel. It folded flat, thin enough to slide into the breast pocket of a sport coat and unfolded in a single motion into a fully operational single-lens reflex camera. SLR, meaning the photographer looked through the actual taking lens via a mirror system that reflected the image upward into the viewfinder, allowing precise framing and focus on a ground glass screen. No guesswork, no rangefinder alignment. You saw exactly what the film would record. In a camera this size in 1972, that was not supposed to be possible. Land had made it possible because he had redesigned the mirror geometry from first principles, filing more than 160 patents on the SX-70's mechanisms alone. But the mechanism was not the revolution. The film was. Every previous Polaroid system, the model. 95. The Pathfinder, the peel-apart Type 100 series, required the photographer to pull a tab, wait a specified number of seconds, then physically separate two layers of material to reveal the finished print. The developing chemistry was contained between those two layers, and the spent reagents had to be discarded. The process worked. It was fast by every standard that had existed before 1948. But it was still a process, still something the photographer had to manage time and execute correctly. The SX70 eliminated the process entirely. You press the shutter. The camera ejected a white-bordered square card sealed dry to the touch, requiring nothing from the photographer. You held it in your hand or set it on a table or passed it to the person you had just photographed, and you watched. The image emerged from white slowly, then faster blue tones resolving first, then greens, then the warm reds of skin and wood, and American autumn light arriving at full color in 60 to 90 seconds without any intervention, any chemistry, any decision on your part. The reagents were sealed permanently inside the print. There was nothing to peel, nothing to time, nothing to discard. The photograph simply appeared. Edwin Land called it absolute one-step photography. The name was accurate. At $180 at launch, equivalent to roughly $1.300 today, the SX70 was not an inexpensive camera. A 10-exposure cartridge of SX70 film cost $6.90, working out to 69 cents per photograph at a time when a roll of 36-exposure Kodak Ektachrome could be shot and processed for under 12 cents per frame. The SX70 was not competing on cost per image. It was competing on something the cost per image calculation could not capture the photograph in your hand before the moment it recorded had finished happening. The American distribution confirmation came not from a camera store or a photography magazine. It came from Sears, Roebuck and Company. For the 1972 Christmas catalog, the single most powerful retail vehicle in American consumer goods, reaching 50 million households by mail, Sears placed the SX70 on its cover. The order that accompanied that placement was 500,000 units before the camera had shipped to a single retail location. Edwin Land appeared on the cover of Life magazine in October 1972, holding an SX70 print of his own hand. The caption identified him as the most important American inventor since Thomas Edison. Whether that assessment was accurate mattered less than the fact that Life's editors believed it worth printing. In 1972, Life magazine still shaped what Americans understood to be significant. Polaroid's competitive moat was not the camera. Cameras could be copied, improved, undercut. The moat was the chemistry. More than 1,000 active patents covering the reagent pod formulation, the timing layer chemistry, the dye transfer process, and the opacification system that prevented ambient light from fogging the print during its first seconds of development. No competitor could manufacture SX70 compatible film without infringing those patents. Not Kodak, not Fuji, not Agfa, not any company in Japan, Germany, or anywhere else. To use a Polaroid camera, you bought Polaroid film. The camera was the lock. The film was the key, and Polaroid owned every copy of every key in existence. This was not merely a business advantage. It was the structural condition of the instant photography market in America for nearly 3 decades. The name on the white border was not a brand preference. It was a chemistry monopoly protected by federal patent law and enforced in federal court. By the time the SX70 had been on the market for 18 months, it had been adopted by institutions that had never previously considered a consumer camera suitable for professional use. The FBI's Identification Division standardized Polaroid Type 55 positive-negative film, a specialized format that produced both a finished print and a usable large-format negative simultaneously for crime scene documentation at field offices nationwide. The United States Navy used Polaroid instant systems for shipboard damage assessment photography, producing documentation that could be transmitted to damage control officers within minutes of an incident rather than hours. Medical schools at Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Michigan incorporated Polaroid's close-up system, the CU5 medical camera, into surgical documentation protocols, producing intraoperative photographs that could be placed directly in a patient's chart before the procedure was complete. Andy Warhol carried an SX70 everywhere beginning in 1973. He shot thousands of SX70 prints of factory visitors of his own face, of the objects and surfaces that populated his working life, using the camera's instant output, not as a finished product, but as a compositional sketchpad. When Warhol died in 1987, his estate contained more than 130,000 Polaroid prints. They are now archived, studied, and exhibited as primary works in their own right. The camera that a suburban family used to photograph Christmas morning was simultaneously the tool of one of the most significant American artists of the 20th century. That ranged from the mundane to the fine art, from the birthday party to the crime scene to the operating room to the factory, was not an accident of Polaroid's marketing. It was the consequence of a technology so immediate, so physically direct in its relationship between moment and image, that every context that needed a fast, reliable photograph found a use for it. The shutter click of the SX70 was soft, a mechanical whisper compared to the decisive snap of a Nikon F or the solid clunk of a Hasselblad. But what followed that whisper had no equivalent in the history of photography. A card emerging, an image arriving. A moment made permanent before it had finished being a moment. No American camera company had ever built anything like it. For a time, that now seems both very long and very short. No company anywhere in the world could. By 1977, Polaroid had built something that most American corporations only describe in annual reports and never actually achieve: a closed ecosystem. So completely integrated camera film chemistry, distribution, and institutional dependency that its removal from the American photographic landscape would have required dismantling not just a product line, but a set of professional habits, federal procurement standards, and institutional workflows that had been accumulating for nearly 30 years. The institutions that depended on Polaroid were not casual users. They were structural ones. The United States Army Signal Corps had standardized Polaroid instant ID systems at every permanent military installation in the continental United States, Alaska, Hawaii, West Germany, South Korea, and Japan. A soldier reporting to a new duty station received a photographic ID produced on a Polaroid ID4 system within the first hour of in-processing. The alternative, sending exposed film to a processing lab and waiting, was not operationally acceptable. Polaroid was not a vendor to the Army. It was infrastructure. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's crime laboratory in Washington, D.C. had written Polaroid Type 55 positive-negative film into its evidence documentation protocols. Type 55, a 4x 5-inch sheet film format that produced simultaneously a finished print and a high-resolution large-format negative, gave field agents a photograph they could attach to an evidence report immediately, and a negative they could enlarge in a laboratory later. No other film system offered both outputs from a single exposure. The FBI did not choose Polaroid because it was convenient. It chose Polaroid because nothing else did what Type 55 did. Every State Department of Motor Vehicles in America operated a Polaroid ID4 or ID5 camera system for driver's license photography. The DMV clerk who photographed your face in 1978 and 1983 and 1988 in California, in Ohio, in Georgia, and Minnesota was operating a Polaroid system. The laminated card that resulted was produced from a Polaroid print. This was not a niche application. It was the photographic infrastructure of American civil identification, operating in every county seat and state capital in the nation, running on Polaroid film and Polaroid chemistry and Polaroid equipment that Polaroid serviced under long-term maintenance contracts with every state government. American hospitals operated Polaroid MP4 copy stand cameras in pathology departments, dermatology clinics, and surgical suites. The MP4, a large, precise, vertically mounted instant camera designed for close-up documentation, produced a clinical photograph that could be placed in a patient's chart within 2 minutes of exposure. In a pre-digital hospital environment where photographic documentation was required for surgical records, insurance claims, and medical education, the ability to produce a print immediately, rather than waiting for a darkroom run that might take 24 hours in a busy hospital, was not a luxury. It was a workflow requirement. Harvard Medical School, the Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins Hospital, and the UCLA Medical Center all operated Polaroid systems as standard clinical equipment. Through the 1980s and into the early 1990s, The American Newswire Services, Associated Press, and United Press International used Polaroid instant prints for a specific and critical purpose: transmission verification. When an AP photographer shot a roll of 35 film and rushed to a darkroom to develop and print an image for wire transmission, the first print pulled from the enlarger was frequently checked against a Polaroid reference shot taken at the same moment. The Polaroid print, available in 60 seconds at the scene, established the correct color balance and exposure reference before the darkroom work began. This was a professional workflow detail invisible to the newspaper reader and essential to the wire photographer working on a 30-minute deadline. Sports Illustrated used Polaroid backs instant film holders that could be attached to a Hasselblad or a 4x5 view camera in place of the standard film back to verify lighting setups before major studio shoots. A photographer setting up a complex strobe arrangement for a cover shot could not afford to discover after the subject had left the studio that a light had misfired or a shadow had fallen incorrectly. The Polaroid test shot taken with the actual camera, the actual lenses, the actual lighting rig was the quality control mechanism that professional photography had used since the 1950s. It remained essential until digital capture made instant preview a standard camera feature. Until that day, the Polaroid back was on the equipment list of every serious American commercial photographer. Andy Warhol shot more than 130,000 Polaroid prints between 1973 and his death in 1987. He used the SX70 not as a finished product camera, but as a thinking tool, a way of fixing visual ideas in physical form quickly enough that the idea did not escape before it could be examined. His Polaroid archive, now held by the Andy Warhol Foundation in Pittsburgh, is studied as a primary record of his visual thinking, not as a secondary document of his work. The camera that Polaroid designed for the American family's Christmas morning became in Warhol's hands an instrument of American art history. That it could function as both simultaneously was not a contradiction. It was the fullest expression of what Edwin Land had understood in 1943, that the photograph delivered immediately was a different object, emotionally, practically, artistically, than the photograph that arrived 2 weeks later in a drugstore envelope. In 1977, Land simplified everything. The one step. A white plastic body with a rainbow stripe across its face, requiring no focusing, no exposure, setting no photographic knowledge of any kind, was priced at $25 and placed in Kmart, Sears, Woolworths, and every American drugstore that carried a camera display. You pointed it. You pressed the button. The photograph came out. There was nothing else to learn. The One Step became the best-selling camera in the world in its first year of release and held that position for 3 consecutive years. By 1978, Polaroid recorded $1.4 billion in annual revenue. 21,000 people worked for the company across 3 countries. The Waltham plant ran continuously. The chemistry vats never cooled. There is a specific sensory memory attached to the Polaroid print that anyone who held one in the 1970s or 1980s carries without effort. The sound of the SX70 or one-step shutter, not a click, but a soft mechanical exhalation, followed immediately by the motorized whir of the print being pushed out through the rollers that spread the developing reagent across the image surface. The card emerging white, warm to the touch, slightly damp at the edges from the reagent pod that had just been crushed and distributed. The discipline required not to shake it. The instruction on every Polaroid package said not to. Though every American who ever held one shook it anyway, a reflex so universal that Outkast would reference it in a #1 song 25 years later. The image arriving slowly, then faster, the way memory itself sometimes works, vague at first and then suddenly completely there. The chemical smell faint, slightly sweet, specific to Polaroid and to nothing else that clung to a fresh print for the first hour of its existence. That smell, that sound, that 70-second transformation from white card to finished photograph, these were not features. They were the physical grammar of a generation of American image-making. Every birthday party, every graduation, every family reunion, every awkward school dance, every first apartment, every Christmas morning between 1965 and 1995 produced Polaroid prints that now sit in shoeboxes and attic bins across America. They are identifiable at a glance: the white border, the square, format the specific color palette that Polaroid's chemistry produced and that no subsequent technology has exactly replicated. They are the record of 30 years of American domestic life produced on film that no longer exists by a company that no longer exists in a factory that no longer runs. But in the summer of 1978, the vats were full. The plant was running. The orders were coming in. Edwin Land, at 70 years old, was still in his laboratory, still working on the next system, still certain that the photograph delivered in your hand, warm, immediate, irreplaceable, was something the world would always need. He was right about the photograph. He was wrong about the film. The first warning arrived not from Japan, not from Silicon Valley, but from Rochester, New York, from the one American company that understood instant photography well enough to attempt it. In April 1976, Eastman Kodak Company introduced the EK4 and EK6 instant cameras at a press event in New York City. The cameras used a new Kodak instant film format incompatible with Polaroid's system, developed independently, priced competitively. Kodak had spent 6 years and an estimated $94 million developing the system. It was a serious product from a serious company with 130,000 American employees, the largest film distribution network in the world, and retail relationships that Polaroid could not match. Kodak's instant cameras appeared in every Kodak dealer account in America within 90 days of launch in drugstores, department stores, and camera shops from Maine to California. Polaroid filed suit for patent infringement on the day of Kodak's launch announcement. Edwin Land's internal response to Kodak's entry was not alarm. It was, by most accounts of people present in Cambridge at the time, something closer to contempt. Land believed, with the certainty of a man who had spent 30 years being right about things, other people thought impossible that Kodak's chemistry was inferior, that the American consumer would recognize the difference, and that the lawsuit would ultimately vindicate Polaroid's position in the marketplace as it would in the courtroom. On the chemistry, he was largely correct. On the market, the situation was more complicated. Kodak's instant cameras sold well, not because they were better than Polaroid's, but because they were Kodak, and in 1976, the name Kodak on a camera package carried a weight of American consumer trust that had been accumulating since 1888. For 4 years, from 1976 to 1982, American instant camera systems competed on American retail shelves. It was the last time any American camera category would be contested exclusively between American companies. Polaroid won the lawsuit in 1990. The United States District Court for the District of Massachusetts ordered Kodak to cease all instant camera and film manufacturing immediately and to compensate Polaroid for 14 years of patent infringement. The damages ultimately settled at $909 million, at the time one of the largest patent infringement awards in American legal history. Kodak exited the instant camera market permanently. An estimated 16 million Kodak instant camera owners were left with cameras that no manufacturer would ever again supply with compatible film. Polaroid had eliminated its only American competitor. It had also, in doing so, consumed 14 years of executive attention, legal resources, and strategic energy that might otherwise have been directed at the signal that was already visible faintly then, with increasing clarity on the horizon of the American photography market. That signal had a name. It was the 1-hour photo finishing lab. Through the early 1980s, mall-based 1-hour photo labs operated by CPI Corporation, Moto Photo, and independent franchisees spread across American retail geography with the speed of a format that had found its moment. For the first time, an American family could shoot a roll of 35 mm film, drop it at a mall kiosk shop for an hour, and return to a finished set of color prints. The processing cost was higher than mail-order lab pricing. The convenience was incomparable. The 1-hour lab did not eliminate film photography. It eliminated the primary practical advantage that instant photography had held over conventional film for 30 years: the weight. If the weight was gone, if conventional color prints could be in your hands in 60 minutes rather than 60 seconds, then the premium that Polaroid charged for its film, its chemistry, and its closed system became harder to justify to the American consumer, who was already watching the price of 35 mm color print film fall steadily as Japanese manufacturers Fujifilm, entering American retail in 1972, undercutting Kodak on price and matching it on quality by 1980. compressed margins across the entire American photographic supply chain. Polaroid's strategic response was the Spectra system, launched in 1986. The Spectra produced a larger, higher-resolution instant print than the SX70 or the 600 series cameras, with improved color accuracy and a more sophisticated optical system. It was a genuinely better camera than anything Polaroid had previously produced in the consumer segment. It sold adequately. It did not reverse the trend. The American consumer who wanted a quick photograph was increasingly finding that quick was no longer Polaroid's exclusive property. Then, in 1995, the signal became a certainty. The Casio QV10, a Japanese digital camera, retailing at $749, storing up to 96 low-resolution color images on internal memory, displaying them on a small rear LCD screen, arrived in American electronics retail. It was not a good camera by any photographic standard that Polaroid's engineers would have recognized. The images were small, soft, and unsuitable for enlargement beyond wallet size. But the QV10 demonstrated in physical form that any American consumer could hold and operate a principle that would dissolve the economic foundation of every film-based photography company in America. The photograph that cost nothing per frame required no film and could be seen immediately on a screen. Polaroid's own engineers had been working on digital imaging since the late 1980s. The company introduced the PDC 2000 digital camera in 1996, a professional-grade instrument priced at $3,000, aimed at photojournalists and corporate photographers who needed digital output for direct-to-press publishing workflows. It was a technically credible product. It was also 3 years late to a market that Canon, Nikon, and Kodak had already entered, priced for a professional segment that was contracting rather than expanding, and dependent on a distribution infrastructure, the professional camera dealer that was itself under pressure from direct corporate purchasing and mail-order discounters. The PDC 2000 did not save Polaroid. It confirmed that Polaroid understood what was happening and lacked the capital structure to respond to it at the scale required. In 1997, Sony introduced the Mavica FD5, a digital camera that stored images directly onto standard 3.5-inch floppy disks at $599 retail. The Mavica's image quality was mediocre. Its storage format was already considered legacy technology by computer industry standards. None of that mattered. The FD5 could be purchased at any American electronics retailer. Its images could be printed at home on any inkjet printer, and its operating cost per image was effectively zero once the camera was purchased. A 10-exposure cartridge of Polaroid 600 film cost $9.99 in 1997, $1 per photograph for a print the size of a playing card. A Sony floppy disk cost 50 cents and held 30 images. The math was not complicated. The market did the math in 18 months. Polaroid launched the iZone in 1999, a pocket-sized instant camera producing postage stamp-sized prints on adhesive-backed film, marketed to American teenagers as a fashion accessory rather than a photographic instrument. The iZone sold well in its first year. It was the best-selling camera in America briefly in 2000. It was not a photographic product. It was a sticker machine. And the American teenager who bought an iZone in 2000 received a cell phone with a built-in camera in 2002 and never bought another roll of instant film. The numbers contracted with the remorselessness of a chemical process running in one direction. 1978, $1.4 billion in revenue, 21,000 employees. 1995, revenue below $900 million, 12,000 employees. 1999 revenue below $600 million, 7,500 employees. October 12, 2001. Chapter 11 filed. 6,000 employees. $948 million in debt. The Waltham plant shut down. The Cambridge Research Laboratory reduced to a skeleton staff. The coating lines that had run without interruption since 1952 stopped mid-cycle and did not restart. What collapsed with Polaroid was not only a company, it was a professional category, the instant film ecosystem that had employed, trained, and certified a specific subset of the American photographic workforce for half a century. The Polaroid ID4 camera operator who had worked the DMV counter in Franklin County, Ohio for 19 years was handed a digital camera with a USB cable and a 2-page instruction sheet. The Polaroid emulsion chemist who had managed the reagent pod formulation at Waltham, whose knowledge of the precise viscosity, timing, and chemical composition of the developing reagent was held in no textbook and encoded in no database, cleared his desk on a Tuesday morning and drove home with 30 years of irreplaceable process knowledge that the company no longer had a use for. The medical photographer at the Mayo Clinic, who had shot Polaroid Type 55 for surgical documentation since 1974, retired in 2002. Nobody trained a replacement in the system. There was no system left to train on. The school photography teacher who had used a Polaroid one-step to teach composition in 9th graders because the instant print gave students immediate feedback on every frame, a pedagogical advantage that no other camera system offered at that price point, found the camera supply closet locked and a note on the door budget reallocation effective. Immediately, the darkroom converted to a computer lab the Polaroids donated to a resale shop on Route 9. They did not retire. They were reclassified. The distinction matters. The cameras did not disappear with the company. They are in estate sales in Brookline and Pasadena and Columbus, in antique malls in rural Pennsylvania and suburban Georgia, in the back rows of thrift store shelves, between broken alarm clocks and incomplete board games. An SX70 in working condition sells on eBay for $80 to $200 and typically finds a buyer within 72 hours of listing. A one-step in its original box with unused film, expired chemistry, degraded prints that will emerge streaked and color-shifted and somehow more beautiful. For it sells for $35 to $60. A Polaroid 600 SE professional camera, the medium-format instant system that equipped American commercial photographers and medical facilities for 2 decades, sells for $150 to $400 to photographers who use it with adapters and modern instant film, and call the results lo-fi, which is the contemporary term for the aesthetic that Polaroid's chemistry produced without intending to. The film problem was solved by a group of Europeans who refused to accept that instant photography was finished. In 2008, the last Polaroid film manufacturing plant in the world, located in Enschede in the eastern Netherlands, where Polaroid had operated since 1964, was scheduled for demolition. The machinery was to be stripped and sold for scrap. The chemical formulations that had taken Polaroid's engineers decades to perfect were to be archived or discarded. Florian Kaps, an Austrian entrepreneur, and André Bossmann, a former Polaroid plant manager who had spent his career operating the Enschede facility, purchased the plant weeks before the demolition crews arrived. They named their company the Impossible Project because everyone they consulted told them that what they intended to do was impossible. Recreate Polaroid's instant film chemistry from scratch using machinery designed for a formulation they no longer had access to for a market that the conventional wisdom of the photography industry had declared dead. The Impossible Project began selling film in 2010. The early results were unpredictable, sensitive to temperature requiring longer development times than original Polaroid film, producing color shifts that ranged from greenish to magenta depending on ambient conditions. The photographers who bought it anyway, and there were enough of them to keep the plant running, did not consider these variations defects. They considered them the specific character of a physical medium operating at the edge of its own chemistry. By 2017, the film had improved sufficiently that the company renamed itself Polaroid Originals, reclaiming the brand name it had licensed from the Polaroid estate. By 2020, Polaroid Originals was selling instant film in 40 countries for cameras that Edwin Land's engineers had designed and built in Cambridge, Massachusetts between 1972 and 1981. The film is made in the Netherlands. The cameras were made in America. The gap between those two facts is the distance that American manufacturing traveled in 40 years. The George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York, the world's oldest photography museum, housed in the former mansion of Kodak's founder on East Avenue, holds a comprehensive collection of Polaroid cameras and prints spanning the company's entire production history, from the Model 95 of 1948 to the last consumer cameras produced before the 2001 bankruptcy. The collection includes working examples of the SX70, the Spectra, the SX70. Sonar, the first camera in American history to use ultrasonic autofocus, a technology Polaroid developed in 1978 that predated its adoption in conventional cameras by nearly a decade. The museum's photography archive includes prints by Andy Warhol, Chuck Close, David Hockney, and Walker Evans, all of whom used Polaroid cameras as primary working tools at various points in their careers. The Polaroid print is now studied as a photographic medium with its own formal properties, its own aesthetic history, and its own conservation challenges. The dye chemistry that made instant photography possible is also, over time, the chemistry that causes Polaroid prints to fade, shift color, and separate at the edges in ways that conventional silver gelatin prints do not. The online community that is formed around instant photography would have been unrecognizable to the Polaroid engineers who designed the SX70. The subreddit r/Polaroid has more than 180,000 members, the majority of them under 35 years old people who were not born when the One Step was the best-selling camera in the world, who have never shot a roll of conventional film, who encounter instant photography not as nostalgia, but as a medium with properties that their phone cameras cannot replicate. The white border, the square format, the specific color rendering of Polaroid chemistry, the warm yellows, the slightly desaturated blues, the skin tones that fall in a range that digital sensors approach but do not exactly reproduce. Instagram filters named after Polaroid's aesthetic confirm that the visual language of a chemistry-based imaging system developed in Cambridge between 1948 and 1981 has become the default reference point for what a certain kind of warmth in a photograph is supposed to look like. The professional knowledge that Polaroid's workforce carried has not been preserved with the same fidelity as the cameras and the film. The emulsion chemist who managed the reagent pod formulation at the Waltham plant, whose understanding of the precise relationship between pod pressure, reagent viscosity, and timing layer permeability, determined whether a Polaroid print developed correctly at 65 degrees Fahrenheit or failed at 55 retired or was displaced in 2001. That knowledge exists now only in fragmentary internal Polaroid documents in the institutional memory of the engineers at Polaroid Originals, who spent a decade reconstructing it empirically, and in the recollections of former Waltham employees who occasionally correspond with film researchers attempting to understand why a specific batch of 1979 SX70 film produced results that no modern formulation has replicated. The Polaroid ID4 camera technician who serviced driver's license photography systems in county DMV offices across the Midwest holds a certification that no institution currently offers and no employer currently requires. The Polaroid MP4 medical photographer, whose close-up documentation technique was taught in hospital photography programs at 6 American universities between 1968 and 1995, practiced a discipline that ceased to be offered as a curriculum within 5 years of digital capture becoming standard in clinical settings. These were not obsolete skills in the way that buggy whip manufacturing was obsolete. They were precise, trained, institutionally certified competencies that the American photographic workforce had developed over half a century, and that were eliminated not because they were poorly performed, but because the technology they served was replaced faster than the workforce could retrain for what followed. Here's the footnote that Polaroid's corporate history does not emphasize, but that the historical record makes undeniable. Edwin Land's work on polarized light and optical systems did not only produce the SX70. Beginning in 1954, Land worked under a classified contract with the Central Intelligence Agency and the United States Air Force to develop the optical and film systems for the Lockheed U-2 high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. The camera system that photographed Soviet military installations, missile sites, and industrial facilities from 70,000 feet, producing images that President Eisenhower reviewed in the Oval Office, and that formed the evidentiary basis for American strategic assessments of Soviet nuclear capability throughout the late 1950s, used optical components and film systems developed by Polaroid engineers in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The same company that put an instant camera in the hands of an American family at a Kmart checkout counter in 1977 had 20 years earlier provided the CIA with the imaging technology that documented Soviet missile installations during the most dangerous years of the Cold War. The Polaroid print on a suburban dining room table and the reconnaissance photograph on Kennedy's desk during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 were products of the same American optical tradition, the same Cambridge laboratory, and the same understanding Edwin Land's understanding that the photograph delivered immediately to the person who needed it before the moment it recorded had finished mattering was a different and more powerful object than any photograph that required waiting to become real. Land was right. He was right for 50 years. In a storage room at the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York, there is a Polaroid SX70 serial number in the low thousands manufactured in Waltham, Massachusetts in 1973. The leather is worn at the corners where a hand gripped it for years. The bellows still seal. The shutter still fires. Someone has loaded it with Polaroid Originals film made in the Netherlands, shipped across the Atlantic for a camera that outlasted the company that built it by more than 2 decades. The photograph takes 90 seconds to develop. The image arrives the way it always did, slowly at first, then all at once the colors finding themselves in the light. The white border sets, the chemistry cures. The moment becomes permanent. It always took 90 seconds. It always will. Somewhere right now in a camera that was built in Cambridge and loaded with film that was made in Enschede, a photograph is developing. The company that made that possible filed for bankruptcy in October 2001. The photograph does not know that. It is arriving anyway, warm, immediate, and already becoming the past. That is what we lost when we lost Polaroid. Not the instant, the particular American faith that the instant was worth building a company around. Every week we tell the stories of the American companies that built the cameras and the film and the chemistry that recorded American life and what the market did to them. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. Leave a comment with the first Polaroid print you remember holding. The next story is already waiting.